Hello, everyone. Um, Finally getting around to finding the time to do these lectures on science fiction. So, by the time you get to this class, you've had at least two classes that have dealt with fiction in general. How to build a character, how to build, how to do some basic world building, how to align the character's arc and desires and motivations with the plot. The character's motivations always determine plot. Plot is the thing that pushes against, etc. Um, so with science fiction, we're basically just taking all of those concepts and then adding in a few variations and ideas into it. Um, Science fiction as a genre, or science fiction and fantasy. If I keep referring to it as science fiction, let's just subsume fantasy into science fiction so that I don't have to keep mentioning science fiction and fantasy or SFF or whatever. Um, so, some of the ideas we're going to be discussing in the subsequent lectures, because I have some visual aids that we're going to go and look at. Some of those come from this book, Wonder Book by Jeff Vandermeer, just to cite my sources. It's a fun book. It's, as you can see here, it's got a lot of illustrations and stuff. It's not quite, it's a modern book, I guess you might say, from my estimation. It, it, it has a lot of visual aids in it, which I guess in today's day and age, we can't be surprised. Just to contrast that though with like another text that's pretty good, but a different topic. This one by Victoria Schmidt, Story Structure Architect, and you see here, it's just all text. All you got to do is just read. So this is more my speed, like books that have a lot of these illustrations, um, almost like illuminated manuscript, so to speak. Like the Book of Kells, that sort of thing, or the Voynich manuscript, which is actually interesting. Anyway, so we're going to talk about some of those aspects today, but I just wanted to kind of cite one of the main sources that we're going to be looking at for the next couple of lectures. And then that should get us kind of oriented to thinking about science fiction and fantasy. Um, as I may or may not have said, I mean, if we think about like popular media, if we think about um, movies, that sort of thing, I think it's 9 out of the top 10 highest grossing movies of all time fall into science fiction or fantasy. I think the exception was James Cameron's movie Titanic, um, which I suppose one might even try to classify that as fantasy. Uh, you know, the, uh, the classic love story, as if that's a thing. So what I'm just gonna do is just present my screen, and then I'm gonna go through my lecture notes so that you can actually see and read along with them. And then in the next lecture, we'll turn toward three defining concepts that I don't think these lectures mention. Some of this is actually intended to just kind of remind you of certain aspects of fiction in case you've forgotten, and then outline a little bit of science fiction, start to define it, start to help us approach the idea of writing something in this genre because it is a really fun genre. It's because it's pure imagination, but combined with human motivations. Because we can't tell a story, even if we're telling a story about a talking rock, right? Even though the rock has no human motivations, it's still talking, which is a human characteristic, and so therefore the human sort of creeps into everything. It's the same in science fiction. So keeping those core elements that you have gathered over the last couple of classes and then bringing that forward into this class, I think will be a lot of fun. But so let's look at these lectures. So The purpose of the class is to expose you to both the tenets of good fiction writing, which you all are already familiar with, as well as to some aspects of science fiction. I cannot be comprehensive in this class simply because there's so much science fiction out there, so much fantasy. Some of it's just broadly known, like Harry Potter. Like everybody knows that series. But there's plenty of science fiction out there that even I haven't had a chance to see. That's just how books and media work. Um, blah blah blah. I used to have this caveat where you can't write about vampires because when I first developed some of these lectures, it was when Twilight was still kind of big. So I was getting a lot of vampire literature and or vampire stories, and they got a little tiresome. So no fan fiction. How about that? We'll change this and just say no fan fiction. Okay. I want these ideas to at least be, 90 to 95% your own, even though you might be lifting or stealing concepts from other authors, because those other authors, I guarantee you, lifted those from other authors and so down the line. Okay, so science fiction can be defined a bit differently from normal fiction. I would say that there are three elements to the broader definition of science fiction slash fantasy. Okay, this genre requires more rules, and those rules have to be established very carefully. Okay, without going into too much exposition. We have to have a bit more exposition in these genres, whereas in normal fiction, we don't need that much exposition. Exposition, as you know, is backstory or context. And the idea here is that if we're writing a story set in our world, we already know the rules. We know that human beings can't fly, we don't live forever, technology is relatively limiting or limited, right? I was actually just watching a video about something called Chat GPT, which is, they call it an AI. It's not technically, but it's a very advanced, I think it's a writing system that can write things based on prompts that you input, and it can like write essays for you. I haven't looked into it personally, but I'm going to because of the writing project that we are all going to engage in this semester, the Exquisite Corpse. Now, in science fiction fantasy, the rules can be bent. Okay, the rules that you set up for your world, they can be bent, but they can't be changed. Okay, so think about like the Harry Potter series. Now, I will be honest, I've not read any of the books. I've seen the first movie. Okay, but if you start thinking about some of the rules in that series, what are they? Okay, that this what's it called? Hogwarts. That Hogwarts, this magical place exists. That magic is a real thing. Okay, that certain people are better at it than others. Okay, even though you might have access to magic and all of that, it doesn't make you like supremely powerful or a supreme being. There are limitations. Okay, the touchstone books for people of my generation, and hopefully still today, would be something like Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And in that, some of the rules are that there are humans, there are elves, there are dwarves, there are kind of higher level beings. They're technically angels, but like the wizards. Okay, so like Gandalf, Saruman is one of these. These are like higher level entities and powers, that there are gods, okay, that have created these things. That humans have normal human lifespans. Elves live for maybe thousands of years. Okay, so dwarves live considerably longer. than humans, but not as long as elves. And so all of these rules kind of set a tone. Okay, and once we start thinking about the backstories to our world that we're building, it helps us to kind of characterize people in the science fiction or fantasy story that we're doing. Okay, so you have to have these rules established. They have to be in there pretty early in the story. Okay, and I'll talk in the next lecture about how to do this. It's called absent paradigms, and but we have to get this in there. Okay, so in science fiction or fantasy, we can't have miracles. Okay, we can't have the characters in trouble and all of a sudden they get around the rule, or they suddenly create something that solves the problem. This is basically a kind of Deus ex machina that in some genres or movies, I guess you might do it. Think about, like, for example, the first Iron Man movie, right, where Tony Stark is in a cave and he has access to the most rudimentary of technologies and somehow builds this Iron Man suit, right? Somehow builds this capacitor that powers it, this infinite power device. No, that's going too far. That's miraculous. So, just something to think about. As Arthur C. Clarke said, where's my cursor? Here's an interesting quote. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Okay? But in our stories, that advanced technology, even though it might seem miraculous, might seem magical, still has to follow rules. Okay? So once you set the rules for your world, the characters have to operate within those boundaries. They can't keep defying the rules, just as you and I can't defy the laws of gravity. Okay? So science fiction fantasy requires that the setting take place usually in one of two places. Future. Now, if you do it in the present, that's fine. But we can do it in the future or alternate history. Alternate present is the same thing. If you think about Philip K. Dick's book, The Man in the High Castle, that is an alternate history where the Axis powers won World War II. And so, for example, America is split up east and west between the Japanese and Germans. And it's a really interesting book if you have a chance to go check it out. They made a movie or a TV series about it some time ago. I did not have a chance to finish it, so I don't know if it's good or not. And the third definition I would say for science fiction fantasy is that it's philosophically, ethically, and morally more charged than normal fiction. Okay. Now, what you're going to see is that sometimes people will use science fiction and fantasy as a kind of political stance. I'm not saying don't be political. I'm just saying that, and you've heard me say this before, that if you're trying to bring forth some political agenda in your writing, it's going to sound forced. It's going to sound dogmatic. Okay. I think I made this silly. Here's my stance: capitalism is bad. Sally sat up in bed. The chains of sleep replaced by the chains of the dollar as she got out of bed to go and earn minimum wage at McDonald's to pay off her student loans. It's hitting you over the head so much with a silly dogmatic message that it doesn't really allow for the writing or characterization to shine through. Okay, but the idea here is that science fiction, because it's dealing with metaphoric or symbolic worlds, characters, etc., technologies, it is way more philosophically charged than normal fiction. Now, normal fiction, of course, delves into philosophical themes. Absolutely. It's just more ramped up in science fiction. So, um, skip over that. Skip over that. Blah 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 blah. Okay. So, when we think of science fiction or fantasy, we could say this. What is science fiction? Mary Shelley, the very famous wife of the famous romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, wrote a book called Frankenstein, a Gothic epistolary novel. Epistolary simply means letters. These are letters written back and forth. It's called an epistolary novel. I believe she was 19 when she wrote that in Switzerland. And, no pressure. So, if we look, though, at the idea of science fiction, if you've ever read Homer, I think that you could say Homer wrote science fiction. You could say that the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the earliest work of literature that we know of, the Epic of Gilgamesh could be considered science fiction. Gilgamesh um, uh, goes into the realm of the dead. He crosses the ocean of death. He beats up the ferryman. He has a flower that will make. He has technologies, okay, available to him that are fantastic, that don't exist. A flower that will make you live forever. Um, and so when we think about the human being's relationship to these fantastical realms through the imagination, this goes as far back into human history as we can trace it. Okay. So if you've ever read Homer, look at Achilles. He gets this magical armor. Go to the Odyssey. Odysseus travels into the land of the dead as well. So the idea of the imagination is core to the human experience. So when we think about science, okay, because science is half of that term, science fiction, the relationship of science fiction to science is subjective. Okay, there are two definitions. There's called hard science fiction, which is where the technologies, etc., employed in the story are relatively plausible. Okay, there are soft science fiction stories, movies, etc., where the elements, the technologies, the abilities, etc., are way less plausible. So, let me think. The movie Star Wars, because of the Force, right? The Force is this like magical property. I don't buy midichlorians at all. I do not believe in that canon. Anyway, but that's what we call soft science fiction because it's incorporating this kind of magic into the story. Whereas something like Star Trek, okay, is far more closely related to hard science fiction because they try to incorporate in the story certain technologies that or explanations for technologies that are relatively plausible, I guess you might say. So another science fiction show that I really enjoyed, except for the last season, is one called The Expanse. If you haven't seen that, it's really good. The writing is really smart. I have not read the books yet. I feel bad, but you can't read everything. Okay. So if we think about like the tradition in which science fiction started, okay, which is to say Romanticism, Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, they were romantic writers, and romance here doesn't mean like or romantic doesn't mean romance. This is a movement, a literary movement in the 1800s, primarily in Europe. And Romanticism is marked by a distrust of science. Science was basically coming into its own around that time. And I don't want to go into too much of the history of it, although I find it really interesting. because we had, prior to this, we had the Renaissance. And then we had the establishment of things like the scientific method. And we had huge advances coming in medicine, technology, etc., the applied sciences. We started to really organize nature around us. And it was in this organization that a lot of writers and thinkers and philosophers started to get really nervous because, here comes Isaac Newton, a bit ahead of Romanticism, but part of the Enlightenment. And he just basically looks out at the universe and says, oh, it operates like a clock. Here's a formula that explains how everything works. And it takes away some of the mystery and some of the beauty and some of the magic and the majesty of nature and life and all of that. Okay, so Romanticism was effectively a reaction to science's growing predominance as far as an explanatory mechanism for how everything worked. Okay, so when we look at this idea of universals in the world, okay, Newton was saying, here's how everything works. That's a universal. Now, of course, Newton was proven wrong later by Einstein. I don't want to go into that. But prior to this, okay, prior to science creating this taxonomy of things around us, right? What is nature? What is this, right? It's very hard to establish actual universals in the world. Now, why? Okay, if we think of a tree, right? If you've taken English 119 with me, this can go right back to Plato, right? How do we define things, right? We think of Plato's levels of the forms, okay? What is a tree? How do you define tree, right? Each particular thing is a refutation of a universal because every particular thing in that category is different, is slightly different, right? If we look at all the trees, I'm looking outside and I see all these different trees. Maybe they're palm trees, maybe they're pine trees, oak trees, doesn't matter. Each particular tree, right, is particularly just like people. Just they're different, but yet they share these categories of commonness or universality, okay? So these are actually really interesting and philosophical debates, okay? Now, Newton wanted to make the universe act like a kind of clock. Okay. Now, Newton could realize that his formulae weren't perfect. And he said that God would have to intervene once in a while to just kind of keep things working properly. Like, he knew that he hadn't gotten it correct. There were a couple aberrations in his formulae that he could see wouldn't work out properly. Einstein had the same problem with the cosmological constant, which he thought was a mistake. He added that into his equations to kind of to make them work properly. And then he regretted it. He said, "Oh man, the cosmological constant, that was a huge mistake." And it turns out his intuition was correct. Like, the cosmological constant has been brought back into physics, which is a really fascinating thing. So anyway, I don't want to go too far into it, but the Romantics didn't want to live in a godless world ruled by science, okay? And a lot of them didn't want to live in a world ruled by the Christian God either, okay? Although some of them, like William Blake, were very, very Christian, okay? So I write it with an X here simply because these are my lecture notes. These aren't for public consumption. Now, what's the problem with science? Why are they reacting like this to science? Doesn't science do nice things for us? Am I getting that wrong? I mean, isn't it nice to have technology and electricity and medicine and antibiotics and anesthetics? I mean, aren't those all nice things? Okay. Well, let's think back to Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein. Okay. We're talking here Dr. Frankenstein, not the monster. When we talk about Frankenstein, that's actually not the monster. The monster doesn't actually have a name. So a lot of people get that wrong, but it's a small thing. So in the book, the Doctor has gone mad. He's mad with power. He is science unfettered by morality, right? He is a grave robber. He cuts up and dissects all these different bodies and puts them all together in order to create life. But it's not life created in the normal moral sense, right? This is life from death. This is the ex nihilo idea, that is to say, something from nothing, okay? And is what he's doing, is it a moral act? Because he's trying to, in a way, get one up on God, so to speak, right? And that's kind of one of his express purposes in the book. Let's skip that. We don't need to talk about deconstruction and literary theory. We've had enough of that. So anyway, in the book, if you go read it, the monster in popular movies or literature is usually presented as kind of a dumb brute, right? This unthinking creature. But in the book, he's very articulate. In fact, he's the most articulate character in the entire book. He doesn't have a community, though. He doesn't have the ability to be human, even though he comes from human beings. Okay? And let me think. There's a TV show, maybe 10 years ago or so, called Penny Dreadful. And it kind of combines a lot of different horror tropes and horror books. But Frankenstein and his monster do make an appearance in there. And in that show, Penny Dreadful, the monster is portrayed, I think, pretty closely to what Mary Shelley would have envisioned. He's very articulate. He speaks in a Shakespearean fashion. It's very interesting, okay? But the underpinning of the book here is that science, because it categorizes, because it insists on labeling and understanding everything, that it isolates the individual, like Victor Frankenstein, okay? And it creates this distinction or difference. It puts human beings apart from one another or apart from nature. Because in order to understand something, you have to be objective to it, right? So science fiction wants to be objective to, science wants to be objective to the thing that it's observing, right? And that's true. If any of you are studying in the sciences and you know about the scientific method, right? You have to be objective, or as objective as humanly possible, to the subject, okay? And that's quite different or difficult, because human beings, we get engaged in things, and that's where the human mistakes start to crop up. Okay. So I think we'll stop there for now. I'll come back and I'll finish this off. This won't take too long. But I don't want these little lectures to go much more than about a half an hour, simply because that way they're kind of like bite-sized and you can get through them. Maybe while commuting or whatever. So that should be a good place for us to start. And then next, we'll finish this off, and then maybe I can skip into the three main, like, conceptual, tropes that science fiction and fantasy employ. And I think that should be a really good lead in. Then I'll circle back and I'll start doing some content, and we'll look at some of the things from Wonder Book here, and we'll look at some stories that are fun. I think probably we'll start with Arthur Clarke's 9 Billion Names of God, which is it's a short and very effective piece of science fiction. So anyway, I hope that helps. And science fiction, fantasy. Let's go.